And so sometimes we look into our culture and we see the fact that they're very concerned with ideals that I think we as Christians can champion and say, I'm so glad you're concerned with justice. However, your perspective of justice doesn't seem to be either grounded in something objective or consistent throughout all the measures of justice. So sometimes, I hear conversations where people, when they bring up the issue of the life of and sanctity of the unborn, then want to bring up something like the death penalty and say, well, if you're in favor of something like the death penalty, then why are you also in favor of something like the defending the life of the preborn? And the answer is it's the exact same issue. I'm concerned with justice. I'm concerned with people who have, get the proper due in terms of these issues of morality that are grounded in objectivity. And I don't punish, say in the case of a rape victim who happens to get pregnant, I don't punish the child for the sins of the father. That's not just. And we need to factor that into this equation in the same way that, in a perfect world, I would say, you look at scripture and it says, if you take a life, then your life is owed. Um you've given up, that right to live. And so in a perfect world, the death penalty, I think, would be something that we can say is scripturally grounded. We don't live in a perfect world, and so there are all sorts of exceptions. But I think we look at this world that wants to hold on to these issues and is very concerned with these issues because I think we're all created in the image of God. However, the grounding for those issues ultimately comes from the clarity of objective morality, which can only be grounded in, I would argue, an objective moral lawgiver like God. Because if we're going to say something is bad, we are therefore positing an objective good. And if we're saying there's an objective good, we're saying there's an objective law. And if we're saying there's an objective law, we're positing an objective moral lawgiver. And so it's a question of, okay, what is that moral lawgiver? Is it the state? Well, I hope not, because we've seen how that works out in the past.
Many people believe it's a state, though. Like,
Yeah,
we
they
actually
do.
are all required as citizens to acknowledge that it is a state.
Yeah, to a certain degree, I think there's a truthfulness into that, in that we see in scripture that God imparts the ability to judge on the state. However, we as people, and particularly Christians, are there to hold the legislators accountable. Because what is law if not legislated morality? And so for people who say, well, you can't legislate morality, I find that a little bit silly in that, we do that all the time. Don't steal, don't murder. I mean, that's morality that's legislated,
Well, in
right?
our entire Western judicial structure, I went to law school. I was enamored with how it was woven together around tests and morals and ethics and standards and consensus. And many of it actually goes back to religion. I think a lot of it is based off of a relationship with Christian scriptures and the Bible. I mean, look at in the United States, like when you take an oath, you would take an oath over a Bible. And that meant something. It should mean something. It ought to, I hope, still means something. And so, I think what I'm really concerned with is that these two tracks for objective morals, right? They used to be more intertwined than they are today. They're now kind of, fractioning apart quite a bit. You now have people trying to change the state's laws to move further and further away from the objective morals from which they were conceived.
The further we move away from, say, the roots that produced the modern Western society that we find ourselves in, the further, and not even necessarily the further we move away from it, but the more we try to disassociate from that foundation, the more we're going to find ourselves in trouble. Because it's the equivalent of wanting the fruit while cutting the roots. And you can't divorce those things, right? The roots that drew the nutrients of ideas like ethics and virtue and justice, those come from a Judeo-Christian worldview, which is ultimately grounded in the objectivity of Christian scripture, right? The Old and the New Testaments. And we see this, and I think it's being granted by a number of kind of thinkers and historians today, chief of which comes to my mind, Tom Holland, not the actor who played Spider Man, but the British historian who wrote the book Dominion. He has kind of chronicled these things. And then others, Douglas Murray, even Jordan Peterson, has kind of s- uh, brought to light more of these ideas that, when we look at these concepts, where do we find their foundation? We find their foundation in the fact that the majority of Western society was built on these principles that come from a Christian heritage. And we've seen examples where we've tried to disassociate from those things following the Enlightenment in the 17th century, where we see things like the communist era and the USSR, where there was a test case in trying to eliminate religiosity in general. And what did that end in? Well, I heard someone say a few years ago that, when, what happened in the last few centuries? Well, the Enlightenment happened where we relied on reason and we moved away from the old stuffy religiosity of traditional religion. Okay, well, what transpired then? Well, mostly genocide, chaos, and war. And you see when you disassociate from that objectivity, what happens? Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they had to import priests and pastors to simply instill morality into people because in a 1984, George Orwellian-esque perspective, when you remove those ethics from society, it doesn't then, you know, gain a populace who can determine what is good and what is evil based on just consensus, and that works out for everyone. No, ultimately, it turns into a might is right perspective. And that's the danger in giving the government power that only God really has the ability to impart.
Yeah, I actually think about what's happening in Los Angeles right now, as you said, wanting the fruit without the roots. And you see right now this cultural ideation around, well, you know, it's time for there to be a massive shift. Let's wipe out everything about the old, very iconoclastic, and instill a new version of it. And like this, this is something that I grapple with, and I'd love your take on it. But in Los Angeles right now, they're really trying to rewrite Hollywood and history for that matter with changing the races of people. So like changing the race of Snow White's all over the news, but changing the race of the Little Mermaid from the Little Mermaid we grew up with as kids, changing in Bridgerton, changing the race of individuals in Bridgerton. And the idea is that, like, that is what is just and good because it is time to do it because of what happened with slavery and how it was horribly destructive and horribly unjust, and there needs to be a rewriting of all systemic society in order for there to be justice, true justice. And this was a narrative I actually bought into for a while. I remember watching Bridgerton and seeing, you know, in old English society, a diversity of ethnicities, and I was like, I love this. This is amazing. But then I started noticing it everywhere, and that like now the Disney characters that I grew up with were being rewritten. And I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And I was like, well, that's fine. That is totally fine as it should be. And then as I started to understand what was really happening, it was like, well, we can cut some corners here and there, right? We see people in roles of leadership that maybe skipped a few steps to get to these roles because in effort of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is, I like diversity, equity, inclusion. That seems like a very important thing in society, and I've always lived my life that way, but I've also worked hard. I also believe that it should be, merit-based first, and then in the final, like, all things should be considered, right, in the final selection for any important role. Um race being one of them because, like, my ethnic story is a big part of who I am as an individual, and maybe that would lead to something beneficial in, for the organization that I'm trying to join. So, I think that, this is, and again, like, we don't get to hear enough from people who are concerned about DEI, why they're concerned about it, which is why I think going to a Christian apologist might be helpful in helping explain some of it, right? Because it's not being anti diversity, equity, inclusion. It's really anti, I think what you said, getting the fruit without the roots, right? And we want to make sure we have a society that has strong roots.